Now we turn to the K function, or better known as Ripley's K function, which is arguably the most familiar and best known second order statistic. And it's referred to as the reduced second order moment. So it is related to the second order intensity that we discussed in the context of the pairwise correlation function, but the relationship is actually quite complex. One can think of the K function as something that measures the expected number of events within a distance from an arbitrary event. So essentially, this thinks of a circle of a given radius surrounding an event and how many points are in that circle. So we already know that the expected number of points within that circle would be the area of the circle multiplied by the intensity of the process. And the K function then is the expected number of such points divided by the intensity. Again, just to recall, we're dealing with homogeneous processes, so lambda, the intensity, can actually be estimated from the process. So that's the concept. It's basically a function that measures how many points surround a given event within a distance range. And of course, when the distance range is small, there's not going to be that many points in there. And when the distance range increases, the number of points that can be expected within that range will go up. The K function is estimated by simply counting the number of events for each point. So for each point, you set a given range R, you draw a circle around that point, and you count the number of events within that circle for that point. Then you do the same for the next point. Again, draw the circle, count the number of points. You do this for every point in your point pattern, and then take the average. And that is the value of the K function. After scaling by the intensity, that's the value of the K function for that particular distance R. And then you repeat the same process for a different distance band. So as I mentioned, for increasing distance bands, there are going to be more and more points on average within that band, so the K function will increase with distance. So it's a cumulative function. As with all the other functions that we saw earlier with nearest neighbor distances, this involves edge corrections. It's the same principle, the same problem, the same type of solution. And we don't really get into the technical details. As before, we have to figure out what is the K function under our reference of complete spatial randomness, or in other words, a homogeneous Poisson point process. And if we just think about this, the expected number of points equals the intensity times the area. So if the intensity is lambda, the area of the circle is pi r square, we divide this by lambda, so what we end up with is the pi r square for complete spatial randomness. So that is the reference that we compare the actual K function to. When the K function is above pi r square, the suggestion is clustering. When the K function is below pi r square, the suggestion is a regular process inhibition, just as the same logic as we've seen for the other functions. And again, in a similar way, we're going to construct a randomization envelope. We'll create multiple random patterns. For each of these patterns, we'll compute the K functions. Then we create the envelope by taking the lowest and the highest value for a given distance range, distance value, and then we plot that against the function. So what does this look like? For our Chicago supermarkets example, we again see that the three edge corrections don't really make a big difference, except maybe at the larger distances where they start to diverge a little bit. The theoretical function for the Poisson process is the dashed blue line, and as we by now should be fairly confident, the Chicago supermarket point pattern exhibits clustering, so the black line, the K function, will be above the blue line. And the same thing with the confidence envelope, the randomization envelope, which is the gray zone. The black line is clearly outside the gray zone. So we can confidently assess that the supermarket pattern exhibits clustering. As before, we're going to look at a couple of theoretical patterns that we simulate, starting with complete spatial randomness. We again have the theoretical curve as the red curve. The K function is the black line, and the lower boundary of the envelope is blue, the upper boundary is green. The black line is clearly within the envelope for the whole range of distances considered. So this again, there is no basis here to reject the null hypothesis. This corresponds with what we would expect under complete spatial randomness. When we move on to our Poisson clustered process, which we've used before, it's the same one. We see the black line clearly above the red line and clearly outside the envelope, above the upper boundary of the randomization envelope, again suggesting very strongly significant clustering of this process, as it should be. And then the third one is a regular process, again using a Matern 2 inhibition process, and here we see the black line below the red line, and clearly so at the shorter distances, but then it creeps into the randomization envelope for the larger distances. So K function, reduced second order statistic, it has a connection to the notion of a covariance. It operationalized this by counting the number of points within a given disk around each event and tracing that function. When it's above the reference line, it's clustering; below the reference line, it's inhibition. An interesting extension of the K function is to account for multi-type points, and specifically bivariate point patterns. And this is operationalized in what is called the cross K function. And it's the same idea. So we again center a circle of radius r on each event and count the number of events within that circle. But now the event that we center on is of one type, and the events that we count are of the other type. So that's why it's called a cross K function. So the idea is, what is the relationship between these two different patterns? So the mechanics are exactly the same as in the univariate K function. The only difference is that we count a different type of points within the radius. And the interpretation is easy if you think about what independence means. And under independence, the K functions of each univariate process would equal the cross K function. So there's no correlation whatsoever between the two processes. They're both random, so by implication, the relationship between them is random as well. But if they somehow cluster, so if they're more grouped together as two patterns, so you have more type 2 events grouped around type 1 events, then that is called clustering. If you have fewer type 2 events around type 1 events, that would be inhibition. So you could look at two kinds of facilities, two kinds of, say, manufacturing. You look at the automobile manufacturing and then the part suppliers. Would the part suppliers be more clustered around automobile manufacturing plants, or would they be more spread out? So that's the kind of application of these cross patterns. Of course, you can also make the multi-type, the same type at two different points in time, and then you can assess whether the pattern of clustering remains the same or changes over time. Again, we use the randomization envelope for inference. If the cross-K function is above the reference for CSR, it is interpreted as clustering, and if it's below the reference for CSR, it's interpreted as inhibition between the two patterns. In the Chicago example, we look at the bivariate, the multi-point pattern, where we take the liquor stores as pattern 1 and the supermarkets at pattern 2, and we see a very strong evidence of clustering of the two. So the reference line for complete spatial randomness is the dashed red line. The gray zone is the randomization envelope, and the cross-K function is the black line above this, suggesting clustering. So this is a K function. One of the problems with the K function is that, if you think about it, as the circle gets larger, there is a greater variability of the average number of points within that circle. And that's where the L function comes from, due to Besag. And basically the L function is a transformation of the K function that tries to correct for this variance increasing with the distance. And so the variance increases with the distance because within increasing distances, the circles are much larger, and therefore there's greater variability in the expected number of points you would find in those circles. And the variance stabilizing transformation is the square root of the K value divided by pi. And as a result, the L function under complete spatial randomness is a diagonal function of R. So you see, you compare the two by either plotting the L function against R, or by subtracting R from the L function, and then the plot is with respect to a horizontal at 0. And so the R function is the same thing as the K function, the same edge corrections, the same everything, except that we have rescaled it and recalibrated against the distance. The interpretation should be the same as R. If we're above CSR, it's clustering. If we're below CSR, it's inhibition. So if we take LR as such, we compare to R, to the distance. If we take LR minus R, of course, then we compare to 0. So if we take LR minus R, then a positive function implies clustering, and a negative function would imply inhibition. Same rationale. By now this should be familiar, the randomization envelope. What does this look like for the Chicago K function after standardization? Notice how the Poisson reference line, the blue dashed line, is the diagonal, and the black line with the different edge corrections is clearly above that, again confirming clustering. And then when we subtract R from the L function, we get something like this. It's a little more jagged. The horizontal is, the red line is centered at 0. It's surrounded by the randomization envelope, and very clearly the L function is above this randomization envelope. So the K and the L statistics are the probably most used second-order statistics to characterize the features of a point pattern. They're relatively easy to compute. Inference is relatively straightforward. If they're larger than the reference for complete spatial randomness, it suggests clustering. If they're smaller, it suggests inhibition. So this function is based on a cumulative notion. We count a number of points in circles of increasing distance and then plot that against the distance. Another function that is not a second order function but has a kind of confusing similar name is the KD function, which was suggested in the context of an economic geography investigation of the distribution of manufacturing plants in the UK. We saw this as an example very early on in the first section of this module. And the big difference in approach here is that it's not a cumulative distribution function. It's not a cumulative function of distances like the K function is, but instead it's a density function. And the principle is very straightforward. We compute all pairwise distances. In essence, we compute half of them because they're symmetric. And then we sort them and compute a continuous density function for these. We could, of course, do a histogram, but we make it continuous by applying a kernel smoothing procedure to what is in essence a histogram. So the result is a density that shows us how many of the interpair distances are associated with smaller values rather than larger values. And of course, as such, this doesn't mean anything. We have to get a reference distribution to compare this to. One of the innovations in this approach, and this is particularly relevant in the kinds of studies to which it's been applied, is that the reference distribution is not necessarily complete spatial randomness. And for example, in the case of the manufacturing in the UK, the argument is, well, the UK is not an isotropic plane. There are zoning regulations and other constraints on the space in which it would be possible to locate a manufacturing plant. And so then those locations are taken as the reference distribution. For example, if you're interested in a particular type of manufacturing, let's say the pharmaceuticals example that we saw before, the reference distribution would not be complete spatial randomness in an isotropic plane, but would be, say, all the possible locations of manufacturing plants in the UK. So it is a similar rationale as what we've seen earlier in the case control setup, where we had cases versus controls. Here, in some sense, the control is the reference distribution, which could be relative to another process. And it gets a little bit technical about how the randomization envelope is constructed and then interpreted. There's both a local interpretation in the sense of significant clustering at a given distance, but there's also a global interpretation. In general, if the density is above the randomization envelope, it suggests clustering. If it's below, it suggests inhibition. This is a bit of a different approach, and there's still some discussion going out in the literature as to what are its merits relative to other techniques. In the nice review article that I have as one of the readings, there is a review of different distance statistics, and you see some specific details there if you're interested. In our Chicago example, for the liquor stores, it looks something like this. So this is very different from what we've had before. It's basically a kernel smoothing of a histogram, and up to a relevant distance. Typically, one does not compute this for all the distances, but one stops because at very large distances, the distribution becomes very sparse. And then with the randomization envelope superimposed, we see that actually the density is at the very outer edge of the randomization envelope up to the distance of about 15,000. And then beyond that, it is not significantly different from randomness. The dashed line, the dashed red line, is not a theoretical value for this density function, but is the mean of the simulated values, the mean of the randomization envelope. So the envelope is constructed by taking the minimum and the maximum, and then the mean is also plotted on this graph. So a different approach, focusing on density rather than a cumulative distribution function or a cumulative notion of counts of points with increasing distances. It's one of the many different summary statistics that have been suggested. So this concludes the point pattern module. Basically, what we've done is characterized point patterns, get a sense of the types of processes that may generate these patterns, how we can summarize them and describe them either geometrically or based on the intensity initially. Then we move on to nearest neighbor characterization, nearest neighbor distance characterizations, and we finally concluded with measures that are based on a notion of pairwise covariance or pairwise correlation, or in general second order statistics, or that take into account statistics like the KD, that is not a second order statistic but takes into account all the distances between the points.